Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over Bobby Fischer, one of the top 3 chess players of all time, if not the best, who dominated the chess world over his short career, beating the Soviets in 1972. And I'm going to be showing you his best games he's played over his entire career. So without further ado, let's get into the video. The first game I'm going to be covering is from 1972, July 23rd, round 6 of the World Chess Championships in Reykjavik, Iceland, where Bobby Fischer is playing Boris Spassky, the reigning chess champion. This match was the turning point of the tournament and shows the absolute dominance Bobby Fischer had over the game of chess and his opponent. The game starts with c4 from Bobby Fischer, the English opening, an opening Bobby Fischer tends to not normally play, and his opponent Boris Spassky plays e6, not making any committal moves. Fischer then plays knight to f3, developing his knight, and Spassky plays d5, confronting Fischer's c-pawn and making him make an important decision. Fischer transposes into the queen's gambit with d4, again an opening Fischer doesn't normally play as white, instead he normally opts for e4, but we get a queen's gambit and black plays knight to f6, continuing his development, declining Fischer's gambit, and Fischer develops his knight to c3. We get bishop e7 from Boris, getting ready to castle kingside and not being too confrontational by playing bishop b4, and we get bishop to g5 from Bobby, developing his bishop and also attacking the knight. We get castles from Boris and e3 from Fischer, solidifying his center pawn. Boris plays h6, kicking out the bishop and also disallowing the knight from ever landing on g5. Fischer plays h4, continuing to attack the knight, and Boris plays pawn to b6, getting ready to maybe play bishop to b7. Fischer now takes in the center on d5, and Boris recaptures with the knight, allowing Fischer to capture his bishop on e7, and Boris takes back with the queen. Fischer then takes the knight on d5, and after pawn takes, Fischer now has the open c-file for the rook, and plays rook to c1. Boris then plays bishop to e6, solidifying his d5 pawn, and Fischer plays queen to a4, attacking weak squares in his opponent's position. Spassky plays c5, expanding on the queen side, and Fischer plays queen to a3, creating a pin on the pawn, because if the pawn was to ever push or take, Fischer can then take the queen. Spassky plays rook c8, also putting his rook on the semi-open file, and Fischer plays a seemingly ridiculous move, bishop to b5, baiting his opponent to play a6 to weaken his pawns, which can later be exploited later on in the game. Fischer plays d takes c5, Boris recaptures with the pawn, and Fischer castles. The a-pawn can't take the bishop because then the rook would be hanging, but after rook to a7, the bishop is now hanging, so Fischer retreats it to e2. We get knight d7 from Boris, developing his knight out, and knight d4 from Fischer. Again, Boris can't take because then his rook would be hanging. Boris then plays queen to f8, and Fischer takes the bishop for the knight on e6, and Boris recaptures with the pawn. Fischer plays e4, sacking a pawn, but hopefully making his opponent have split pawn structure that can easily be exploited. Spassky plays d4, ignoring this, and Fischer continues to build up on the king side with pawn to f4. Spassky plays queen to e7, and Fischer, instead of playing f5, decides to lock the position down and play e5, preventing the knight from jumping 20 squares. We get rook to b8 by Spassky, and bishop c4 from Fischer, attacking the weak e6 pawn, and placing the bishop on a better square. Spassky plays king to h8, getting rid of the pin on the king, and Fischer rotates his queen to the king side and plays queen to h3. And if Boris captures the b2 pawn, then bishop to b3 would trap the rook. Spassky then plays knight to f8, and we get b3 from Fischer, defending his bishop on c4. Spassky plays a5, and Fischer continues his attack with pawn to f5, and after Spassky takes, rook takes, the pressure is starting to build up. Spassky plays knight to h7, and Fischer plays rook f to c1, doubling up the rooks, creating a big attack, and Spassky then plays queen to d8, defending the back rank, and Fischer plays queen to g3, continuing to add pressure. Boris then plays rook to e7, and Fischer just plays pawn to h4, disallowing the knight any forward momentum. Spassky then puts both of the rooks on the second rank, and Fischer continues to attack with e6. Spassky then plays rook to c7, just shuffling his rooks, and Fischer plays queen to e5, creating a pin on the g7 pawn. And after black plays queen to e8, we get a4 from Fischer, solidifying his queen side. Spassky then plays queen to d8, because he has nothing left to do in the position except wait for the inevitable. Fischer then plays rook to f2, and Spassky plays queen e8. Fischer then plays rook f3, shuffling his pieces, trying to think of an attack, and we get queen d8 again from Spassky. Fischer then rotates the bishop to d3, trying to attack the h7 knight. Spassky continues to shuffle his pieces and plays queen to e8. Queen e4 from Fischer, creating a battery with the queen and bishop on h7. And after knight to f6, Fischer plays a brilliant move and plays rook takes f6, sacrificing the rook, because after takes, the king is left completely vulnerable. We get takes from Boris, and rook takes from Fischer, completely shredding the king of all safety. And after king to g8, bishop c4 from Fischer, defending the e6 pawn. King to h8 from Spassky, and the last move of the game is queen to f4, and Boris resigns, because he's getting mated, and there's simply nothing he can do. And it is said after this game, Boris Spassky, Bobby Fischer's opponent, applauded, and so did the audience. Now let's move on to the next game. The second game I'm going to be covering is between Bobby Fischer and Robert Byrne, the brother of Donald Byrne, whose game against Fischer I'm going to be covering next. This game was played in the US Championships on December 18th, 1963 in New York, and the game is known as the Brilliancy Prize because of the brilliant sacrifice Fischer played, and because he made his opponent resign in 21 moves. So let's get into the game. Fischer has the black pieces, and Robert plays d4, queen's pawn opening. Fischer responds with knight to f6, the Indian game. White then plays c4, taking space on the queen side, and Fischer plays g6, transposing into the king's Indian defense. We get g3 from Robert, wanting to fianchetto his bishop as well. We get pawn to c6 from Fischer, wanting to play d5 and put pawns in the center. And Robert plays bishop g2, fianchettoing his bishop. Fischer then goes forward of his plan and plays d5, advancing in the center. Byrne takes, and Fischer takes back. White then develops their knight to c3, and Fischer continues his development by playing bishop g7, getting ready to castle, which is what he does. After e3 from his opponent, he castles, getting his king to safety. Robert then develops his other knight to e2, getting ready to also castle kingside, and Fischer plays knight to c6, continuing to develop. White then castles, and Fischer plays b6, wanting to put his other bishop on b7 as well. White then plays b3, and it's crazy to think that this game ends in just another 10 moves. We get bishop a6 from Fischer, pinning the knight to the rook, and we get bishop a3 from White, developing their last minor piece. Fischer then plays rook e8, getting ready to push e5 and break open the center. And that's what he does. After queen to d2 by his opponent, Fischer plays e5, taking lots of space in the center of the board. Because after pawn takes, knight takes, his knight is now a lot more active. Byrne then plays rook to d1, trying to create an attack on the d5 pawn, but there simply isn't anything to attack, and Fischer just plays knight to d3, further advancing his knight into enemy territory, attacking lots of weak squares. We get queen c2 from Fischer's opponent, which is a blunder, and Fischer has the magnificent knight takes f2, sacrificing the knight, because after the king's forced to take, else he'd just be losing material. Fischer has knight g4 check, and after king back to g1, he simply has a fork on e3, picking up the rook on the next move. Robert, not wanting to lose his queen, plays queen to d2, but Fischer, instead of taking the rook, instead opts for another magnificent move and plays knight takes g2. And again, after king takes, we get d4 from Fischer, making the knight on e2 lose a guard, so then Fischer can pick it up on the next move along with the queen, as there's a skewer. So after knight takes d4, we get bishop b7 check. King f1 is played by Robert, and after queen to d7, White resigns, as Fischer is up loads of material and is about to gain more and potentially threaten a checkmate. This game shows how great Fischer is at spotting tactics, and how ahead of his time he was back then in 1963. Now let's move on to the best and last game I'm going to be showing you in today's video. The third and last game I'm going to be showing you, and arguably the best game Fischer has ever played in his whole career, is a match between him and Donald Byrne, the brother of the person from the previous game I've shown. And the match was played in Fischer's home of New York, in a tournament on October 17th, 1956, called the Third Rosenwald Trophy, and it's round 8. This game shows Fischer's utter brilliance and his amazing capability to spot strategic plans, like the one conducted in this game, where he won in just 41 moves, after sacrificing his whole queen. So without further ado, let's get into the match. Fischer has the black pieces again, and the game starts with knight to f3 by Fischer's opponent, not wanting to make any committal moves. Fischer copies him and does the same with knight to f6, and his opponent transposes into an English with the move c4. Fischer plays pawn g6, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop on g7 and go for a King's Indian sort of setup. We get knight c3 by Fischer's opponent, developing both knights out towards the centre, and Fischer plays bishop g7. Donald then plays d4, taking space in the centre of the board, and Fischer castles, getting his king into safety. Donald then plays bishop f4, developing his bishop out, and Fischer transposes from a King's Indian into a Grunfeld with the move d5. White then plays queen b3, wanting to attack black's weak d5 pawn, so Fischer takes, and queen recaptures, and Fischer plays pawn c6, controlling the d5 square. We get e4 from Fischer's opponent, taking even more space in the centre of the board, and Fischer develops his other knight out and plays knight d7, getting ready to route it to b6 and attack the queen, and that's what he does after rook d1, putting the rook on the semi-open file. Fischer plays knight b6, attacking the queen. The queen sides forward to c5, and Fischer develops his last piece and plays bishop g4. Fischer's opponent then plays bishop g5, getting ready to trade the bishop off for the knight, which is a losing move, and Fischer's opponent's first mistake. Fischer then plays knight a4, attacking the queen again with tempo, so the queen has to go back to a3. Fischer then takes a knight on c3, and pawn recaptures, weakening the a2 pawn. Fischer then takes the pawn on e4, and goes up a pawn, but it's short-lived, after Donald takes his pawn on e7, forking the queen and rook. Fischer doesn't care though and just plays queen b6, giving up the rook for the bishop. Donald, too scared to go up the exchange, just plays bishop c4, and we get the brilliant sacrifice by Fischer, knight takes c3, attacking the rook on d1 if white was not to take the knight. We get bishop c5 by Fischer's opponent, attacking the queen with tempo, and Fischer plays an in-between move and plays rook e8 check, forcing the king to lose castling rights after king f1. We get bishop e6 from Fischer, another brilliant move, completely sacrificing the queen, which his opponent happily takes, which is a losing move. After bishop takes c4 check, king g1 only move, knight e2 check, king f1 only move. Fischer then picks up the pawn on d4 with check, forcing the king back to g1. He then repeats this with knight e2 check, king f1, knight c3, king g1, and then he takes the bishop on b6 with the pawn, gaining a tempo and attacking the queen again. We get queen b4 by Fischer's opponent. Fischer then plays rook a4, attacking the queen again. The only safe square for the queen is taking on b6, but after this the knight takes on d1, going up in exchange. h3 is played by Fischer's opponent, giving his king some breathing room. Fischer then just takes the pawn on a2, threatening the f2 pawn next. Fischer's now up 4 points of material. We get king h2 by Fischer's opponent, trying to run away, and knight takes f2 by Fischer. White is now in a completely losing position, and there's no way for them to recover anymore. Rook e1 is played by Donald, and Fischer just takes it because he's up material. Knight recaptures. We get queen d8, an in-between move, bishop f8 blocking, and then knight takes on e1. Fischer then plays bishop d5, getting ready to attack the g2 pawn, and knight f3 is played by Donald. Fischer then plays knight e4, rerouting the knight, and Byrne then plays queen b8. Fischer plays b5, getting ready to make a new queen, and Byrne then plays h4. Fischer responds with h5, not allowing any counterplay, and Byrne then plays knight e5, as he literally has nothing he can do in this position, as he's down too much material. Fischer then plays queen g7, getting out of the pin, and Donald then plays king g1, and he's about to get mated. After queen c5 check, king back to f1, knight g3 check, and it's mate in 4. After king e1, bishop b4 check, king d1, bishop b3 check, king c1, knight e2 check, king b1, knight c3 check, king c1, and rook c2 is checkmate. An absolutely beautiful game by Fischer, sacrificing his most valuable piece to win the game, showing his understanding and knowledge for the game, and proving how good he is at the game. And if you want to learn more about good games top players have had in their career, watch this video here about Magnus Carlsen's top 3 games of all time. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, make sure to subscribe. I'll try and post a new video every week, as they take a while to make. Have a good day.